What's up, folks? Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise. My name is Trevi, and we are being inundated with an immense number of Warzone Nachmund spoilers coming from the chapter approved, being released, I think, this weekend, probably. At the very least, we'll have a lot of spoilers from it this weekend, and we'll have it in our grubby little mitts probably as late as next week. But I'm going to talk about a couple of the things that were previewed. The first one, and the biggest one that I'm going to talk about a little bit later, but I want to get through this article first, is a wholesale change to how armies are constructed in Warhammer 40k that's going to have an enormous impact on a ton of factions. That's coming from a leak that's been doing the rounds. But first, let's talk about this article on Warhammer Community that talks about some of the changes in the upcoming chapter approved, or in the upcoming GT specifically, I should say. We do have an interesting change noted here for missions. They talk about how missions have been changed and how their secondary objectives have generally been turned into an additional scoring parameter that you can get, which is information that we already had. What we didn't have was this change to the Scouring mission, which is pretty big, actually. This is a kind of a picture for ants. It's very difficult to make out on the Warhammer community page. But one important thing is to note is that Scouring has been moved to a take and hold objective rather than a domination. Previously, in the 2020 and 2021 versions of GT, the Scouring was a hold 2 to score 5, hold 3 to score 10 mission, which made it very difficult to score and also extremely swingy. Whereas if you took one objective from your opponent, it could potentially be a 10-point swing. Whereas, holding 2 objectives would score you 5 points. However, holding 3 would automatically mean that you're holding more than your opponent, which means you not only would you score 10, but you'd also score that 15. Which meant that sometimes, 1 or 2 things happening over the course of the game could significantly change the outcome by just, giving you a bunch of primary objective points for freezies, basically. That's been changed. It's now a hold 1 to score 4, hold 2 to score 8. And then you also have that mission-specific primary objective score on there as well. Mission-specific secondary strategic scan has been changed into the alternate primary that Scouring has, so you can score 3 points for at the end of the game for each objective that you have strategically scanned, which has essentially the same verbiage that the strategic scan action on the secondary objective already had. It allows one unit from your army to perform the action at the end of your movement phase within range of an objective marker that has not been scanned, that also has no enemy models on it. It's completed at the start of your next command phase, so it takes an entire round to score, but if you do, you'll just get 3 primary objective points. Pretty sweet. Now, the thing I like about the primary objective scoring being mission specific is that not only does it make each mission a little bit more unique and play differently, but it also allows you to either get ahead or get back into the game if your standard primary objectives haven't been scoring very well, or if you just want to ignore it and you don't feel like you can score it at all, you can just go for holding the objectives the normal way, and you will still have the opportunity over 4 rounds to score 48 points potentially, getting 12 points a turn on that normal take and hold, which means you can still max your primary objective score, even if you haven't scored this special mission-specific secondary whatsoever. So unlike the secondary objective, that doesn't tie quite as much emphasis to completing those strategic scans, whereas a lot of times, especially if you didn't have a good mission-specific secondary, or you didn't have an army that was particularly suited to the Scouring, you would want to take data intercept because in some instances it was a pretty well scoreable secondary, but sometimes ran away from you, especially if you went second. It was actually kind of ludicrously terrible if you went second. You would be lucky to get 1 objective scanned, whereas going second in the new version gives you bottom round 5 scoring, so you actually have a little bit more of a leg up on the standard primary objective score, which is pretty good. It's also completes your strategic scan at the end of the battle, so if you are going second, you actually have an additional leg up on that primary objective, because you can start to strategic scan at the top or at the bottom of round 5 and then have that be completed to score those 3 points. That's noted in this tiny insect text that's in Aspect Scan action. So I think all told, good changes so far to the Scouring. It probably ends up going from one of everyone's least favorite missions to probably being a pretty well playable one. Interestingly as well, it has been the weird deployment zones we used to see on this objective, which were very small. They were pushed 6 inches in from the side, or 8 inches in from the side, I think, which made things a little bit awkward because a lot of armies had a tougher time fitting into that deployment zone in a reasonable way. And that's been gone. It's now a full table edge deployment zone, which feels good. Feels good. We see some previews to primary objectives. The assassination has not changed, so thanks, I guess. But also, they are previewing the faction-specific secondaries that are being included in Warzone Nachmund for the factions that do not have one. These have already been spoiled or leaked for the most part. We have a gallery of all of the photos that have been going around for a while of all of these faction-specific secondaries. There are a couple of them that they're very strong. Some of them, not so much. So, unfortunately, the adage of faction-specific secondaries kind of being a hit-or-miss thing will continue. The Astra Militarum one, you get a victory point for killing an enemy unit. It seems totally fine, but you can only get 3 victory points per battle round for it, and your opponent needs to have 15 individual units for you to score it. And you can only do it with Astra Militarum units, so if you soup it all, it doesn't matter. It's a solid secondary because you can score passively over the course of the game, but the restrictions make it a little tough. They mention changes to keywords and list building, which we're going to talk about in a moment because we do have that entire page leaked for the list building rules. So that's what we're going to talk about right at the end of this video. Before that, though, however, we do have a change to how fortifications work, and this... it's going to be interesting. Essentially, the rule remains where in a GT game, if fortification can't be set up outside of 3 inches of other terrain features, then it doesn't get set up at all. However, when you go to place that fortification, this is specifically when setting up a fortification model on the battlefield. So generally, it's going to be during your deploy step. When you choose that fortification, when it's your turn to place a unit on the table, and you choose that fortification to be deployed, this rule comes into play. That timing is important because of some of the weird interactions this rule can create. The change here is that if you cannot set up that unit because of other terrain features blocking you off, then you may remove one piece of terrain that is in your within your deployment zone, importantly not wholly within. So even if the tiniest sliver of a terrain feature is in your deployment zone, you are able to remove it. And this can be gamified a little bit by, for example, deploying units such that the space to place the fortification would be blocked off by a terrain feature. Even if it's only a little bit in your deployment zone, then you set up your fortification as normal with the changed game state in mind. If it's still not possible to place the fortification, you just put the terrain feature back and the fortification counts as destroyed as it did in the previous version. Now, I imagine we do have an ellipses here, so I wonder if there are additional rules for deploying fortifications, or maybe, additional rules governing fortifications, specifically ones that determine when in the deployment step you do deploy those fortifications. For example, if there's a rule in the deploy armies that says that players must deploy fortifications before other units in their army, a lot of the interactions that I'm about to talk about get removed, including, for example, the one where you can place models in your deployment zone such that you physically restrict your own fortification from being placed, that then allows you to remove terrain that you don't necessarily want. This gets super weird if you are, for example, using multi-level terrain with models on it. One of the many reasons I kind of dislike multi-level terrain is because of these interactions that it creates. But let's say that you have a 2 or 3 level ruin and you've placed a unit on the top floor of that ruin. Then you go to place your fortification, and because of the ruin, the fortification can't be placed. You can then remove the fortification, but I don't believe that there is any rules precedent regarding what happens to the models on the ruin. They are now, I guess, theoretically floating in midair, and they can't move anymore because they can't move along the battlefield or along a terrain feature, so they just live floating in midair, and you just have to kind of pretend with your opponent that you've wobbly modeled them on an air molecule or something. It's not very good, I think. So I hope that there are some additional rules governing how this rule will, change how things are placed. I think ultimately, while it does make fortifications a little bit better, I don't know how much it's going to impact the game. There are a handful of fortifications that are worth playing if they aren't restricted by being placed. However, having to remove, potentially line of sight blocking terrain in your deployment zone in order to play those things is going to be a pretty big deal. It is nice to see fortifications getting a little bit of love. We will have to see how the book is actually worded once it comes out. But there is a potential for this rule being an absolute nightmare to actually resolve on the table, and I hope that's not the case. I hope it works as intended. And that's basically it for the article. Now let's move on to this leaked page that we have from the GT2022 Warzone Nachmund book. And this talks about this change to the muster armies step of the game. and how keywords have been changed during your army construction. Now, most of this page is absolutely identical to the rules that we already have. For example, you put your models in detachments, the detachments have to share a common keyword that isn't one of the super faction keywords, Chaos, Imperium, Eldari, Yanari, or Tyranids. But we have a new paragraph here at the bottom of the first column. All of the units in a player's army that have selectable faction keywords, which are faction keywords represented in angular brackets that a player selects when they add those units to their army, must have the same selectable keywords. Then we have some examples. For example, this means that all units with the bracket chapter keyword, so that would be for Space Marine players, in a player's army must be from the same chapter. And all these units must replace the bracket chapter with the name of their chapter. All units with the bracket Cabal keyword must be from the same Cabal. All units with the Witch Cult keyword must be from the same Witch Cult, and so on. The only exceptions are Mark of Chaos and Allegiance keywords, so that doesn't break Chaos Undivided lists, thank goodness. Dreadblade and Freeblade keywords can be selectable. That's just in order to stop some of the specific knight abilities from being locked up. We also have the normal super heavy detachment ability that was introduced in the last MFM. This is basically unchanged from the previous version. If you have a super heavy auxiliary detachment, it can refund 2 of its command points if it shares the same faction, not super faction, with your warlord. So if it's in the same sub-faction generally, which they all have to be the same now as your warlord, then you get some points back. But this is a really huge change. I think, unfortunately, it does sort of impact the game differently depending on how your different factions want to be played. But this means that any sub-faction souping has been removed from the game, essentially. You can no longer play multiple Space Marine chapters together. You can no longer play, for example, multiple Orc clans together. That's a big one that's going to brutally impact Orc list construction. Imperial Guard get hit by this. Those poor Imperial Guard players get hit in the splash zone of a lot of these changes that are targeted at some of the higher tier armies, and I do feel for them. You can no longer play, a majority Catachan or Cadian list, for example, and then also soup in some Talarn tanks. No more. Everything has to be the same regiment. Grey Knights can no longer take their Prescient Brethren plus Sword Bearers. They can only take one of the two. The one part of this that I am kind of a little bit annoyed about is that the Drukhari, all of the Drukhari selectable keywords are separate. So obviously, it calls them out specifically. You have Cabal, Witch Cult, and Homunculus Coven, all of which are a separate selectable keyword, which means that Drukhari, to be fair, the faction is built entirely around souping, but they're basically remain unchanged. You can no longer in your Thick City lists take Artists of the Flesh in one detachment plus Dark Technomancers in a different detachment to get the benefits of both on the different units that they're good for. You have to pick one, but to be fair, Drukhari players were mostly moving to pure Artists of the Flesh anyway, and they're still going to be able to take their other sub-factions alongside them without any change. So the strongest faction in the game remaining the strongest faction, and some of the sort of mid-tier to lower-tier factions getting hit by this change, which doesn't feel great to me. I appreciate the intention behind this change, which is to make list construction easier, to make parsing game states easier. You no longer have to demarcate all of your different sub-factions throughout your army because they all have to be the same. It makes list vetting easier for tournament organizers. All of that stuff is a little bit better, but it feels like Games Workshop from 8th edition had embraced this philosophy of kind of total list building freedom, which is why we got all of these rules that allowed you to soup chapters together, that allowed you to soup factions and sub-factions together and take all of these different zany combinations, which, if that is the intention of the game, I think that's fine. But the awkward part is that they're now in 9th edition walking that back. And instead of doing it in a wholesale manner, we kind of get these little dribs and drabs of rules that govern list construction, which instead of having the effect of making list construction easier, now makes list construction different depending on the format you're playing. So if you're playing a standard match play game, not GT, you can still soup your sub-factions, but if you're playing GT, there's this additional constraint that if you're new to a GT format, you might not necessarily be aware of. And I wish this was just rolled into a core rule. Just say that works for every sub-faction keyword. Remove the specific sub-rules out of codexes for the sub-faction keywords. and put them in the core rules. Have a core rule governing how bracketed keywords work. Full stop. It works like that for every codex. We no longer need these individual faction rules, which just muddy the waters and make things super difficult. And maybe we just get rid of like souping entirely. As much as I think souping is probably a positive for the game in that it generates a lot of creativity and interesting list builds, for 95% of players, it's not really a consideration, especially if you're playing a faction that's not like an Imperium or an Eldari faction where souping isn't part of the game plan. Maybe we make a special consideration for Chaos or something, which is a little bit more thematically and mechanically designed to be souped together, but it feels like with the amount of restrictions and penalties that are imposed on factions that are souped, Games Workshop really doesn't want you to soup your armies anymore. So it's sort of strange to me that they still allow it, and in doing so create all of these list construction rules that people are complaining about constantly, with detachments and faction keywords and sub-faction keywords and all of these things interacting in bizarre ways and requiring pages and pages of rules to govern. You could just say you can't do that anymore, and it would take all of that pressure away. You could make the game so much simpler, but instead we get these sort of piecemeal changes to list construction in the game. I mean, it is what it is. At the end of the day, this is overall a simplification, and it is going to be a big meta shift. I don't necessarily like it, but, there it is. It's there, and it's going to change how lists get constructed, at least for GT games, for the foreseeable future, and there it is. So I'm sorry for everybody who is playing a faction predicated on souping. I know back in the day, playing Tyranids, you played, faction A plus Kronos in almost every list, and you can no longer do that. Fortunately, as a Tyranid player, we did get the Leviathan and Crusher Stampede supplements, which has changed Tyranid list building quite a bit, and now you're basically locked into Leviathan. And I think a lot of the other factions that are getting sub-faction supplements that are super powerful are just going to be sticking with those sub-faction supplements for the future anyway. But for now, that's anybody who doesn't have one of those. I'm sorry, it's gonna suck for a little while until you find a sub-faction that you want to build your whole army around. Except for Drukhari, obviously. Drukhari can just do whatever they want still, because they're the poster children of 9th edition, I guess. I don't know. GW's favored pointy-eared sons. Anyway, that's all I have to say for today, folks. Hope everyone's excited for the new Nachmund book. I think we're, like we just talked about in the video yesterday, got a lot of really cool stuff coming down the pipeline for Warzone Nachmund. I am excited about these new missions. I am very excited about at least the new points values. List construction rules maybe a little bit less, but it is what it is. I want to throw a quick reminder out to everybody who wants to support the channel over on Patreon, at patreon.com/tacticaltortoise. Also, YouTube channel members, Twitch subscribers, all those people help me keep the lights on, and I appreciate them. We're going to be doing a lot of giveaways, specifically for patron members over the course of the T5S2 Invitational. So if you are a patron member, those will be free to enter for people watching the stream, but if you are a patron member, you also get an entry to those as well. So join the Patreon. We're going to be giving away, I think we got some Orc box sets. We got some more Black Templars box sets. We got some other odds and ends that we're going to be giving away to people watching the T5S2 Invitational streams, which I'm super excited about. So anyway, remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.